Hey, it's Chronologically Gaming, the only channel that's perpetually retro because we're playing every video game in order of release. Welcome to the Backlog. This is where we leave no game left behind. We're going back and playing all the video games that we missed or people pointed out that we didn't see yet. So we're going to be showcasing and seeing as many games as possible before we reach 1983. Let's go. We're going to start all the way back in the very beginning where we started the show. This is 1971, and I think I originally said January, but no, this game is Galaxy Game, the very first video game that we're going to be starting here on Chronologically Gaming, and this begins in September 1971. Now, Galaxy Game we've already seen on the show, and I actually could be starting earlier than this if we wanted to. Like, we had to settle on a one date to start. This just happened to be the one for 1971. I mean, there is a way to play games from the 60s, for example, Space War, which this is based on the PDP, but again, we just had to pick a start date. That's why we're here in 1971. We also could be starting with games around 1971 from Oregon, the game that was eventually inspired Oregon Trail. That was on the teletype. So because that wasn't technically a video game, that one also wasn't showcased here on Chronologically Gaming. But there's also the one in the 60s that inspired so many games right now in the 70s, which was the Brown Box by Ralph Baer. We didn't cover that one in the 60s because we're just starting at this point here in 1971. So this was the first game. We have already played this one, but the next video game is a little more interesting. Our next release is still in the arcade. It is still 1971, but this one a couple months after Computer Space or Galaxy Game. In fact, you could say Galaxy Game and Computer Space, they've been switching dates to see who's the first one in the arcade. They keep going back and forth if you check online. This one is a Computer Space that we're saying is November 1971. Let's check it out. We're actually going to be able to play this one too. We've already seen the advertisement for Computer Space where they're modeling a very futuristic arcade cabinet. It is out of this world. There's two different versions of it. Usual one is the one-player only mode, and then there's also a two-player mode. So this one is again the one-player model of Computer Space, and there, the very rare two-player model, which you can see has very rudimentary joysticks similar that we saw back in Galaxy Game. And there it is, another example of the arcade cabinet. Really awesome design. I mean, of all the arcade cabinets we're used to seeing, this one is very standout. And this, again, is the second video game in the arcade. Here's the arcade control panel for the two-player mode. You can see we have rotating the joystick and then firing the missile to move around. What in the world? And that is the example of the screenshot, and that's all we showed last time. Let's pop in and go to the arcade. The beginning of the arcade and play Computer Space. This is by Nolan Bushnell and Fred Dabney, released in November 1971, so it could be debated if it's November or September. They keep going back and forth. This is the very first video game that we've seen published by Nutting Associates. They did some video games in the arcade before this around the 60s. This is just the very first time we've seen it. And this is done by Syzygy Engineering, which means it's pre-Atari. This is the very first video game by Nolan Bushnell and Fred Dabney, who eventually found Atari. This is the very beginning of it. All right, so let's just go right into it. I'm going to put in my 25 cents, push number 1, and then we are in. Unlike Computer Space, this one is controlled only with buttons. So I use a button to thrust my spaceship, I use a button to fire the spaceship, and then I can use the buttons to turn the ship and also control where the bullet goes. So if yikes, I'm dying so fast. We have a static screen that does wrap around. See how I move around, flying one side of the screen to the other. Ooh, I can even fly by the score. That's pretty cool. Right over, there by my ears where they're showing the score for the game. But this one feels a lot like, I would say plays a little better than, whoa, there we go. Plays a little bit better than Galaxy Game. It actually feels closer to a game we're going to see much later, Asteroids. Oh, wow. Yeah, being able to push the button to turn left and right, it's very similar control scheme. So you can see as I fire my shot, I have the ability to twist and turn and direct the missile. There we go. Finally, we got a hit in there. So the version I'm playing is the one-player only version. Later, there's a way to play with someone else, kind of like you did with Galaxy Game. But this one, I would say is still a fun time, but this one wasn't very commercially successful. It's more complicated. If you want people to get into video games, you got to make it pretty simple. I'm feeling this is still, it's simple enough, and I'm controlling it enough, and having a pretty good time, and I think that's all I got. Yeah, you can see they were giving me like a countdown. Let's put another coin in, and go. Yeah, there's a timer down at the bottom. It's a game that's based on how much time you can get the high score. So you can see I got 1 point there. And how are they? I really want to see how they're doing. Interesting. So the bullets that the enemies shoot, they continue to go, but my bullets stop. It looks like theirs go all the way across the screen. Yeah, so it's keeping track of their score and my score, it looks like. Man, the sound, though, is... The way that we're playing this is through a simulator, just like we did with Galaxy Game. And so I don't know for sure if the simulator is simulating the sound as accurately as it would. I was told this is very accurate to the original computer space. And this is really cool to be able to play something that is before Atari was Atari. This is the game that they brought out. This is what we refer to as a multi-directional shooter here on Chronologically Gaming. This one's the arcade formula, which is a video game that is intent for fast action, continuous play loop, and going for a higher score. And this, of course, is based on the time. You can see the time's ticking up. We got to hurry up and finish this up. This is also the second time we've seen a video game that we refer to as a dual shooter. In other words, you have the ability to fight off against someone else. You and someone else are shooting one another on the screen. I still like the gravity and the inertia as I fly around. It feels pretty good. And I actually think this one controls a little better using the buttons rather than the joysticks. Well, again, the one-player mode of it. Very, very cool. All right, so this one is another video game that does not have a microprocessor. It's a DTL or TTL, transistor-to-transistor logic-based video game. And some people would argue that that video game is not really a video game. That everyone has their opinions on when you could start calling video games video games. This is where we started. 1971 is how Chronologically Gaming begins. So the two-player version of this one was released later, and it pit both players against one another. It resembled the original Space War and Galaxy Game, and it can be played solo and revert to the original single-player too, but that one's really rare to find. This one's a lot more popular to find. All right, so now after actually playing Computer Space, my experience here in 1971 would be, yes, I would say this one is better than Space War. Obviously, they're taking riff on, not Space War, Computer Space, Galaxy Game. They're taking a riff on the Space War PDP-1 style game, but I'll still say, of all the games you could play, this one is above average, 3.5 stars. And I can understand why it wasn't as commercially successful as all those other ones. All right, so with that means we are done with 1971, the video games that we're going to see here on Chronologically Gaming. Let's move forward to 1972. And the next video games we get to see are on the very first home console, the Magnavox Odyssey. I think I originally said they were using cartridges when they're really not. They're using these chips to integrate with the system, but the first real cartridge-based console would be the Fairchild Channel F that we'll see later. So this is the Magnavox Odyssey. We were able to play majority of these games. I'm just going to breeze through, refresh your memory of what we were able to sample using simulators. Every single one of the games for the Magnavox Odyssey could be considered also a board game, because sometimes they had actual board games included with the video game, or they had cards included with them. So I was able to boot up some of these simulators, but I wasn't really able to capture the full experience of playing on the Magnavox Odyssey, because you need all those pieces, all the parts to come with this, which we really don't have. We did our best, but as we go through, the same video games we could not play or simulate is the same here. But this console has a lot of firsts. So right now in 1972, it's not just the first home console. We also play the very first educational game here on Chronologically Gaming. We play the first baseball game, the first game of tag or chase, the first light gun game, because they had a light gun, big giant rifle. We also played the first football game, the first early childhood game, the first Pong style game. Yeah, Pong, at least before Pong, because this system is based on the brown box that originally was done by Ralph Baer. It's also the very first haunted house game or setting that takes place in a haunted house. We played the very first strategy game. There it is, Invasion. Again, very rough because it's having to rely also on the board as well as the overlay, which what we're seeing here. This is a overlay you put over the television to play on your Magnavox Odyssey. So out of all these games in the Magnavox Odyssey, I wasn't rating them too highly. Right now, this is all you got. I could have rated them higher, but I'll just keep them all the same. The ones that we couldn't play, we'll still say we are not rating those games. But this is all the games that we originally had seen on the Magnavox Odyssey. Look at this. So many titles. All the way through some educational ones, some where you're just moving the light source across the television. Still going. Tennis, volleyball, and most of these games are using the same technology that the brown box had, so you're getting games that kind of feel like Pong, very similar. I'm gonna still call them Pong variants. All right, so then after Wipeout, let's see what our next game is after these original games for the Magnavox Odyssey. All right, that sound usually means it's time for another Star Trek variant, but no, this is Star Trek, just Star Trek, released in the arcade. But it's not official. Oh no, this is an unlicensed Star Trek game. And it's also not the mainframe game that was from 1971. That's more of a strategy game. This is Star Trek. Look at that. And the front arcade cabinet is giving images of the Enterprise, but they're not. It's not really the Enterprise. This is a whole unlicensed, unfabricated amalgamation of game. It's currently September 19th, 1972, at least from my understanding, this was first released. This is by 4Play Manufacturing Corporation. It's the first time we've seen this company. This is a clone of Computer Space that we saw from 1971. The use of the Star Trek name is totally unauthorized. It bears little resemblance to the television series. Even this flyer artwork and what we're seeing here has inaccurate depictions of the Enterprise. So this, again, would be another multi-directional shooter if we could play it. But get a load of that joystick, if you want to call it that. I think they're still using the twist instead of an actual full-range joystick on the screen. But they're not using what we saw with the buttons, the button layout at least. So here's the advertisement flyer. The most exciting name in space is now yours for the biggest profits on Earth. The spaceship and player against the computer and invading forces, the hottest appeal yet developed in a game. And again, this is so new, only 1 year after we saw Computer Space, that ripping it off, you bet Atari sued them. This is the very first video game that we've seen that's been involved in a legal dispute or a lawsuit. The very first video game right here. So this is also the very first Star Trek fan game that we're seeing here on Chronologically Gaming. The third multi-directional shooter of all the video games up to this point. The very first video game that's inspired by a TV series, you know, Star Trek, even though it's basically a clone of Computer Space by Syzygy, or, you know, eventually will be Atari. It's also one of the very first video games we've seen that's incorporating a sci-fi theme. Both Space War and Computer Space and the original games we've seen, they're all sci-fi themed, and we're just going to be seeing lots and lots of sci-fi video games. Oh, there we go. And again, another shot of the arcade cabinet. I'm going to include a link down below where you can check out the blog spot of this gym, how people found out about this and then put it on the web. And there's the example of the screenshot. It looks really similar to Computer Space. But that's all we have for Star Trek, which means this is our first video game we're not going to be able to rate. We're going to keep it a 0 or a not rated game because we're not really able to check this one out. All right, after that, let's see what our next game is. Next is the big of the big, the best of the best, the cream of the crop. And we've already seen it here on Chronologically Gaming. This is Pong. Pong is the top tier video game. In fact, I'd like to re-rate this one. When we originally saw it on the show, I said 4 stars, but Pong is a 5-star game, and you will soon see how popular. It's not just going to be cloned on home consoles later, it's also going to be cloned in the arcade very, very soon. Pong is amazing. At this point, we've already seen 6 video games that were very similar to Pong on the Magnavox Odyssey because they use the same concept. Let's just, you know, bounce the light back and forth across the screen. So it's not a brand new concept. This is very similar to the brown box idea that was from 1962. But this one is the very first commercially recognized video game and successful video game. Pong is where it's at. All right, and with that, let's go now to 1973 in video games. Our very first video game, again, takes us to the arcade. This is Paddle Battle, released sometime in March 1973. Let's check it out. Paddle Battle is another video game that I have just heard about from Moby Games and got some information and some artwork for it. This is Paddle Battle. Allied's biggest secret is out. There's no competition. It's very fascinating checking out advertisement flyers for arcade systems when this is just so new. If you look at the arcade cabinet and the screenshot, it is yet another Pong clone. There's the example of the arcade cabinet. Whoa, look at the knobs. Usually the paddles they have, like for the Pong, were moderate size, but those are gigantic. So this is by Universal Research Laboratories and Allied Leisure Industries, the very first time we've seen anything by these companies. And it is yet another ball and paddle style video game made popular by Pong, and then before that, the brown box. So this one is the very first video game that was involved with a legal dispute after Pong, I should say. The first legal battle to fight Pong, because this is essentially a one-to-one clone of Pong. From what I understand, the arcade boards that they made for Pong got in circulation, and people just started to copy and just release the exact same game. So there's lots of suing going on by Atari taking their Pong idea. So there's the arcade cabinet, and there you go, Allied's Paddle Battle. And it is just another Pong, another variant of Pong, the very first variant of Pong after official Pong was released. So this one, I could rate this. I'm not going to rate it the same as Pong, obviously, but we're not able to play it ourselves because there's no simulator for this specific one. So I'm going to, again, rate this one 0 for all the, or not rating this arcade cabinet for all the video games up to this point. All right, let's keep going. In 1973. This is another one that's released at sometime in March 1973. And when we say sometime in the month, we usually give it the rating of, this would be March 31st, 1973. But that doesn't mean it was released March 31st. It just means sometime in March is when we know this arcade game was released. This is Rally, just Rally in the arcade. This is our 30th video game. Let's take a look at the artwork for our 30th video game here on Chronologically Gaming. This is the 6th video game we've seen in the arcade so far, and Rally is competitive, fast action, space age game. No two games alike, and it creates repeat play. That's pretty cool describing it now, because it makes sense, but right now we can definitely see how we're able to, it's not generating a lot of replay value. We kind of understand the game. Fun for all ages. 25 cents to play. 1 and 2 people can play. You can see they got the little paddles again, the knobs over the top. This is the second time we've seen 4-play manufacturing here on Chronologically Gaming, and it's the 9th ball and paddle game we've seen across everything so far. The 9th ball and paddle or Pong-ish style game. There we go. Oh, it's 1973. All right, look at that wood grain. That arcade cabinet. And the other thing, too, to notice is the arcade cabinets, there's no really standard right now. Everyone's just doing whatever they want to. I mean, look at that. That actually looks pretty slick if I had my way. This is also the 27th video game that we played where the control input is paddles. Thanks to a lot of those games we saw on the Magnavox Odyssey, which controls with paddles. That's the popular input or video game way to play. Twist that little knob and have some fun. And it is another video game that is using transistor-to-transistor logic. There's no microprocessor inside, so we don't really have a way to play it. This is the 8th time we played a video game that is a variant of Pong, and we're just getting started. So they do have a mode in this one that allows you to play single player or against the computer. So this is the very first Pong-style video game where you can play against the computer. Right here, the Rally is. The original Pong, you had to have 2 people to play. But this one, you can have the computer, which is pretty cool. But I'll still say of all the games you could play, we're not able to play it ourselves, so it has to go with our no rating for Rally. Well done, Rally. Let's see what our next game is. This is Ping Pong. And we got to go and see what's on the tube. All those kids are having so much fun.
Just a minute.
Nancy, come on.
So that was a clip from the movie Juggernaut from 1974, where they have this game. This is Alka's Ping Pong, or just Ping Pong. It's now released at some time in April 1973. So Ping Pong. This let's check out the artwork for Ping Pong. Not to be confused with table tennis, which had ping pong as a theme on the Magnavox Odyssey. This is our 31st video game we've seen on Chronologically Gaming and the 7th video game in the arcade so far. This advertisement flyer is not the best quality, but you can kind of get the idea. This is Alka Electronics' very first video game that we've seen, and it's the 10th ball and paddle arcade game that we've seen so far. It's also the second time we've seen a video game that's trying to make a theme of ping pong, which you can say that's what Pong was based on too. So this is the 28th video game that is using paddles to control. Look at this. Alka Electronics and ping pong. It's so cool. They're ripping off Pong, and not just, I'm saying, copying the idea. Alka took the actual arcade boards, from my understanding, and brought them over to Europe and manufactured it over in Europe. This is the very first video game in Europe, the very first one, and it started with piracy, hardware piracy to bring it over. There's the example of the arcade cabinet. This one is the 31st video game we've played or showcased here on Chronologically Gaming that has a DTL or TTL logic scheme, so it's not using a microprocessor. And it's the third video game that's been involved in a legal dispute because, yes, Atari sued them too. Star Trek was the other one, and then the second time for Pong. This is the 9th video game that is a variant of Pong, but I like the style of this one. The color looks all right, but it is actual Pong copied inside of the arcade cabinet. There's another example of the arcade cabinet. Every arcade cabinet has to have wood grain here in 1973. Very nice. Yeah, it's showing the adjustable score, 2-player, and this is 2-player only. You have to have someone else, like you just saw in the commercial or the movie. So as we saw with the other games, we cannot rate this one, so it's going to have a no rating for ping pong. But more Pong, lots of variants and clones coming up. Let's see what our next game is. Oh, our next one's a fun one. This is kind of a stretch. So a video game is going to be used very loosely with this one. This is Laser Clay Shooting System. And this one couldn't really truly be arcade. It's pretty close to arcade. It's close enough. It is July 10th, 1973. This is our 32nd video game that we've seen so far on Chronologically Gaming. And it's the 8th video game we've seen in the arcade so far. This is the very first thing we're going to be seeing that's by Nintendo, the very first venture. It's the first blending of Nintendo working with toys and then going into electronics. That's what Laser Clay Shooting System or Laser Clay Shoot would be. This one is by Nintendo. Gunpei Yokoi, Genyo Takeda, Hiroshi Yamauchi, and Masayuka Yorimura. They were all involved with this. And essentially, they saw that by 1973, bowling was starting to decline in popularity in Japan. So Hiroshi Yamauchi and Gunpei Yokoi thought of this concept to install in deserted bowling alleys a 16mm film projector providing moving targets that players have to shoot with light guns. There were smaller models manufactured under the name Mini Laser Clay, and this gave way to Nintendo's Mini light gun peripherals and games. This is the very beginning of them using that technology that we're going to be seeing later, way later, on the Nintendo Entertainment System. So this one technically isn't a video game because it's using a video display backdrop. It uses film, you know, like a movie projector. But laser clay shooting was Nintendo's very first venture into anything in the video game market or close to video game, even though we are going to be seeing some other games that use actual film projection as the backdrop, at least here in the beginning. So this one is the 5th video game we've seen that is a light gun shooting gallery arcade game, and it's using a light gun. So the 5th game, because we played several on the Magnavox Odyssey. So this one is a video game that has you shooting clay, skeet, you shoot birds. And let me just show you a little bit of the artwork for this one, because obviously we can't recreate this. We need some rifles. We need the bowling lanes. But this is so cool to see for the first time. Over on the far left side, they're giving you instructions of what you do when you go. Imagine going to a building. It looks like a bowling alley, but instead of bowling, you grab a gun and you're shooting things against the backdrop of the screen. It's such a cool idea. You can get a really good idea down in the bottom left corner of what it was like to play the Laser Clay Shooting System by Nintendo this far at this time. And then they also are explaining how to do your stance, how to shoot, because no one could use guns. Guns were outlawed in Japan. And so this was a really fun recreation for anyone in Japan to go and shoot some guns. Every one of these rifles were real rifles, but they were all loaded with blanks. And I'll show you an example. This is what the venue first looked like in 1973. And this is the case that you got. Whenever you came up and bought a lane, they gave you a case with your gun inside. Look at that. You got an actual gun, and it was firing off blanks. So you had the kick of the gun, you had the noise of the gun. You know, it's a little muted with a blank, but still, it's a real gun. We thought the gun that they were using on the Magnavox Odyssey was hardcore. This is Nintendo's up in the ante. This is the way to do a light gun. It is the most real rifle for a light gun game ever. I don't know if there's anybody that's going to make it even real than this. So there's some examples of some of the patches you could win and what it was like to get the pieces before you went to your lane to go shoot some stuff. That's so cool. I'm going to give a lot more information. There's a blog for a link down below you can check out if you want to learn more about the laser clay shooting system that Nintendo put and did. The other thing they do is they provide you with this sheet similar to bowling where you can write down your score, you know, how many things you shot. And this also includes ducks. They had ducks flying around on the screen. It's like the very beginning of Duck Hunt, old school Duck Hunt here in 1973. Look at that. And there's some examples of the smaller units where you're able to bring your pistol. It is the coolest thing by Nintendo. And this is the very first thing from Nintendo so far. So another video game that we can't rate ourselves. If I could, I'd give it 5 stars. It's so cool. But I'll go 0 stars because anything we can't actually play, emulate, or simulate ourselves, we're just going to stay with a no rating at this point. All right, after that, let's see what our next game is. Coming up next, it's Space Race. It's July 16th, 1973. Our 33rd video game that we've seen on Chronologically Gaming and the 8th video game we've seen in the arcade thus far. This is the second video game by Atari and the second game by Alan Alcorn. We've already seen this on the show, and we did the same we did with the other games. We're not going to be able to rate this one, but it's essentially a borderline racing game. I'm just going to call it just straight up arcade game. It's very, very simple. Race your opponent to the other side. Try to get across the star field. If you touch stars, then you die. But there you go. And that's where we got to put our video game playing on pause, this time on the Chronologically Gaming backlog. Join us again as we continue checking out all the video games that we missed as we fly through the 70s. We're going to be going from 1973 pretty fast all the way through 1978, or 77, I should say. So that's it for today, but like I always say, it all begins in the arcade. Hey everybody, thanks for checking out the channel and joining me on my quest to play every single video game in order of release. We'll be streaming live every weekday at 9 p.m. Central, so join us and let us know if we missed any games along the way. This video would not be possible without Launchbox, RetroArch, and MAME. Tell all your friends there's some crazy guy named Chronologically Gaming trying to play every single video game. We have links down below that'll send you to places like our Discord and Patreon, and one that says all the video games we've ever played. If you go there, it's a list of everything, and you can click right to the game you want to see. Chronologically Gaming is the name to look for. We are perpetually retro, and we will catch you next time.